Welcome to a conversation with the editors and contributing authors of Teaching Civic Engagement Globally, a new publication by the American Political Science Association. My name is Elizabeth Maddow, and I'm one of the co-editors of Teaching Civic Engagement Globally, and I'm an associate research professor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University and direct our Center for Youth Political Participation. We're very happy to be hosting this event today in partnership with the American Political Science Association. And at the outset, I'd like to thank Stephen Smith, who is the executive director of APSA, and also would like to thank John Gerstle, APSA's director of publishing. We're particularly gratified today to begin our conversation with opening remarks from the president-elect of the American Political Science Association, Professor John Ishiyama. Professor Ishiyama is a university distinguished research professor of political science at the University of North Texas. Professor Ishiyama has served as the editor-in-chief of the American Political Science Review and was also the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Political Science Education. His list of honors and achievements is considerable, so I'll only highlight a few recent ones. In 2020, Professor Ishiyama was awarded the University of North Texas Foundation's Eminent Faculty Award, which is actually the highest scholarly award given by that university. In July of 2019, John received the APSA Member of the Month Award. And in 2018, Professor Ishiyama received the Distinguished Service Award by the Political Science Education section of APSA. Throughout his career, John has been a leading voice in the discipline for advancing the teaching of civic engagement. So it's perfectly fitting, and we're so grateful to have him here today to make a few opening remarks as we begin our program. So I'm very happy to introduce the president-elect of the American Political Science Association, Professor John Ishiyama.
Thank you, Dr. Maddow. And thank you all for inviting me to say a few words to open this webinar today on teaching civic engagement globally. I would first like to congratulate the editors, Professors Maddow, McCartney, Benyon, Blair, Sun, and Whitehead, and all of the contributing authors for producing such a critically important work, particularly in these days when democracy is globally under threat. I am very pleased to have been asked to help open this webinar on this edited volume, a book that not only covers a critically important topic, but also covers a variety of themes regarding civic engagement in a variety of subfields of political science and international relations, and in a variety of countries throughout the world. The scope is indeed quite impressive. The chapters provide experiential insights from educators around the world, and really, in my view, provides a vitally important comparative perspective on civic engagement education, something thus far, I believe, has been sorely lacking. This volume will prove to be an invaluable resource for scholars and practitioners alike everywhere. I believe that there's really no better time than now for an appearance of such a volume, especially when democracy itself is under assault globally. We know that the promotion of civic engagement helps strengthen civil society, and that a strong civil society and civic engagement holds political leadership accountable. This helps stave off the creeping authoritarianism we now see spreading throughout the world. We also know that civil society and an engaged citizenry act as a school of democracy, training citizens and a generation of leaders how to participate, to organize, and ultimately to govern. This book, in my view, is an important step in helping rebuild civil society as a bulwark of democracy, particularly by helping educate our young people to become responsible participants in our global political processes. I also see this book in line with the American Political Science Association's efforts to promote civic engagement and touches upon questions which are of great interest to me in particular. In particular, how to rethink the role of political science education in rebuilding, building, or reinforcing democracy. I believe that this book and its content has much to say about how we rethink the role of political science education in helping to promote student and civic engagement to help build a better world. My opening comments will be short because I want to give all of you enough time to talk about your own important contributions to this effort. Again, I'd like to close by thanking the editors and contributors for inviting me to say a few words in opening this webinar. And I wish you all well and success in your webinar today. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor John Ishiyama for joining us today. At this time, what I would like to do is introduce our co-editors, the co-editors of Teaching Civic Engagement Globally. And together today, we're going to be sharing some of the themes of the text and having some short conversation with a selection of our contributing authors who are joining us literally from around the globe. We have authors today from Greece, from Russia, from Mauritius. So it's an exciting day. So now I'd like to introduce our co-editors. I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Allison Rios Millett McCartney from Towson University, Professor Elizabeth Benyon from Indiana University South Bend, Professor Alastair Blair from De Montfort University, Professor Tai Sun from Christopher Newport University, and Dr. Dawn Michelle Whitehead. And Dawn is the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. So Teaching Civic Engagement Globally is the third APSA publication dedicated to this topic. And I should make it clear at the outset, and we'll say it several times, that all of the publications are free and available online on the Teaching Civic Engagement microsite, which we will share the URL several times throughout our webinar. All three books, though, share a common theme, that a thriving, peaceful democracy require an informed and engaged citizenry. But also that such citizenship is not genetic, it's not guaranteed. It must be learned and it must be taught. The first publication produced by the American Political Science Association was in 2013, entitled Teaching Civic Engagement from Student to Active Citizen. And the goal really of that text was to reach out to political scientists and to provide pedagogical models from various subfields of political science that would be applicable to diverse teaching styles, settings, campus settings, but also really emphasizing that teaching democracy, teaching democratic citizenship is a core element of the mission of political science. The following book came out in 2017, Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines, and really made the call that teaching democracy extends beyond political science is really a multidisciplinary effort. So in that text, we offer a range of pedagogical models extending beyond political science and even including models from English, from civil engineering, and even the arts. And just to amplify Professor Ishiyama's statements, currently educators around the globe are facing significant challenges in teaching politics. In an era in which populist values are on the rise, authoritarian governments have been legitimized, and certainly core democratic tenets are being undermined by leaders and citizens alike. Hence, teaching civic engagement globally. So at this point, I'd like to hand off to my colleague, Professor Allison Rios Millett McCartney, who will give us a sense of how we got to this point. And then she'll hand off to Dr. Whitehead, who will give us an overview of the book and really lead us into our conversation with authors. Allison?
Thank you, Dr. Matto. Well, today, as many people have said thus far, we face challenges and anti-democracy threats within and external to established and establishing democracies. We have internal division, persistent racism and discrimination, the rise of populism, changes in economic system, climate change, power changes in the international system, increased violent conflict in the post-Cold War era, and, of course, COVID. These situations form the context of our students' education, growth, and development. Although frustration and discontent in our communities is not new, The prevalence of discontent and the questioning of the value of democratic institutions and processes at all levels of our governments and societies is new in the context of these global changes and in our students' contexts. Most alarming, we are seeing a consistent decline in youth participation and youth satisfaction with democracy. FOA et al. Have found in a global survey that amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, dissatisfaction with democracy has shown the steepest increase, more than double the previous generation at that same age, and the steepest increase amongst all age groups. This rise in dissatisfaction correlates to a decline in civic engagement education for this group. In these contexts, we have a duty as educators to help our students learn to address threats to democracy, not just by researching and writing about these threats, which is important, but also by teaching them to confront the social, economic, and political sources of these threats and to work together peacefully, despite differing viewpoints, to maintain and improve our democratic systems. We can achieve this goal by teaching them knowledge about democratic processes and institutions, the issues that arise in our communities, and how to discern credible sources of information. We can achieve this goal by providing them with the opportunities to build and practice the skills necessary to navigate and lead in a democratic context. We need to teach them about and foster the values of diplomacy and lifelong participation. And finally, to achieve these goals, we can offer them opportunities to experience participation and leadership to build a sense of efficacy that their voices and their actions matter. In sum, we need to provide options for all students in all disciplines, at all types of educational institutions, and in all countries. As we pursue other educational goals, we need to include civic engagement education so that we are fostering what Danielle Allen has termed participatory readiness. This means that we need to build our democracies with geographically, professionally, and politically diverse people who hold a wide variety of viewpoints and experiences, and who are educated in how government works, how problems can be peacefully confronted, and how we can work together to find mutually beneficial solutions. If we do not, we will forfeit all that we fought to protect and build in too many wars in the last century. As Dewey and Booton have reminded us, these democratic citizens, those who fight for democracy, are not just born. Rather, we have to continually renew and build participation, leadership, and support for democracy. We cannot just teach it once and be done. No, just like math skills, vocabulary, and reading skills, we must regularly build and add to a ladder of learning for democracy throughout a student's education. In the post-Cold War context and an increasingly globalized higher education situation, civic engagement education is vital to thwarting authoritarian challenges to democracy and the loss of people's rights, and continued research and idea exchanges on best practices in civic engagement education with colleagues across the world is crucial to answering these threats. This book hopes to bring educators together throughout the world in a community of civic engagement education practice that is accessible to all and brings the benefits of civic engagement to youth around the world, so that every child has their own arsenal of democracy in their knowledge, skills, values, and sense of efficacy. Now, how do we plan to get there? Well, let me turn this conversation over to my co-editor, Professor Dawn Whitehead of AAC&U.
Thank you so much. And as you can see, we have fully acknowledged the global context of these increasing challenges to democratic and civic engagement. And for us, it was critical to offer perspectives from around the globe to explore teaching civic engagement. In the 21 chapters of this book, the research is situated in both established and establishing democracies, offering readers a wide context of how civic engagement is taught in many different contexts around the world. The book also seeks to decenter North America as the basis for civic engagement discourse, and we are pleased to have contributors from 41 countries, again, to broaden these perspectives on teaching civic engagement. The book is divided into 4 sections, and as we noted, you will hear from the editors and authors from each section shortly. Section 1 explores ideas and developments in civic engagement education through case studies with collaborative linkages between local, national, international, and intergovernmental organizations. Section 2 presents examples of teaching practices around the world that illustrate in a very practical way what has and has not worked, as well as charting areas for improvement. Section 3 looks at the teaching of civic engagement education through the lens of country case studies, including examples of civic engagement centers, study abroad programs, and co-curricular initiatives. Section 4 sets out key global issues and challenges in moving civic education and education forward and identifies necessary pathways for future work. And our final chapter is a call to action, and we will hear more about that shortly. The order of our webinar discussion will mirror the structure of the book. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professors Alison Rios-Millett-McCartney and Alistair Blair for Section 1.
Thank you, Dr. Whitehead, and welcome, Alison, Dr. McCartney, across the pond, so to speak. In this section, we cover a range of case studies, looking both at different countries as well as different political systems. And that ranges from Brazil to Singapore and from established democracies to less liberal contexts. To begin that, I'm going to ask a question and introduce one of the authors who's here today, J. Sherry Strachan, who's with her co-authors, Deborah Lepreet, Candice Hartwells, and their chapter focuses on Stop Training Global Political Hobbyists. So, Dr. Strachan, the book starts with your chapter. It sets out important fundamental groundwork for all civic engagement education across the world. Can you explain the problem of political hobbyists? And then can you highlight why and how women are often excluded in political deliberation, and mention a couple of ways that we can overcome the exclusion from the political sphere in democracies?
Thank you so much. So we had lifted that term, stop training political hobbyists, from a recent book from one of our political science colleagues at Tufts, which really emphasized that, it's not enough to provide people with political knowledge. It's not enough to have expertise that you can fight over the water cooler or over, at the pub over a beer, and be intimately familiar because you've paid attention and processed a lot of political information. That we were overlooking both broadly in society, but also within our own discipline, that we were overlooking the importance of celebrating people who actually have the art of organizing, right? The sort of the core of democracy is average citizens' ability to organize and insert themselves. And if you're not doing that, you're the same as someone watching an NFL football game in an armchair on Sunday, screaming instructions, right? Or spouting off your knowledge without actually being in the game. And so we use that sort of as a call to arms to say, we have to continue this endeavor. We have to convince people that just knowing things about politics without marrying it with those, really applied skill sets that we used to get through natural political socialization. But the opportunity to do that in so many places in established democracies has eroded. In other places with more authoritarian regimes is difficult to do without putting yourself in danger. And so, how do we move past that has been a framework for, a lot of the work that I've done in the US context. But then with this book, thinking about how do we take that next step. And as we were, over the past 15 years doing sort of immersing myself in this work with the help of the section, with the help of support from APSA, my own work revealed that as we were trying to cultivate engaged participation, many of our pedagogies and approaches, because they were developed at a time when who we were teaching, who was in our classrooms, were largely, privileged upper middle class white men, didn't work for everyone. And so we developed a notion that civic engagement pedagogy must be intersectional. So, you have to, not just the students who society has told you're in charge, you should feel comfortable in this space. They're already sort of sensing that they should go on and be political leaders, either in the US or to influence global political decision-making. we need to do that for everyone that comes to us, especially as our student body is expanding. And so, you know, my own work with deliberation it doesn't work. We have to tweak it. We have to fix it. And so we saw lots of parallels to transnational, from the civic engagement work to the transnational, the scholarship on transnational feminism. And so I dragged Deborah and Candace into this chapter and said, you all have more expertise there than I do, and please help me. Yeah, so that I can either pass it back to Alistair, or you know, Candace and Deborah can certainly talk about a little bit about transnational feminism and how we use that as a model.
I think,
Alistair, why don't we move to the next question?
yeah, I think in the context of time,
Yeah, sorry.
we're going to probably move on. But thank you very much for setting that context and also raising an important and challenging set of questions, which are further uncovered in the book. If we can move on to Dr. Sun, one of our co-editors of this book. In your chapter, one generally does not really think of putting civic engagement education in the context of China. Can you briefly explain how civic engagement education can work, even in the non-democratic context of China?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Blair. My chapter title is Importing Civic Education into Authoritarian China. There are indeed tremendous challenges to teaching civic engagement in authoritarian countries, and the challenges are probably more severe now than it was when I collected data 3 years ago. But my chapter argues that there is still hope. Educators should be aware that even authoritarian countries are not monistic. There are different stakeholders and diverse interests that educators can leverage to their advantage. For example, when we were organizing civic engagement education workshops in China, the local governments would often send officials to monitor what was going on. One day, an official came up to us and asked whether we could get his son to join our workshops at Harvard. So his identity as a father was obviously prioritized over his identity as a local government official, and the practitioners teaching civic engagement under authoritarian rule could utilize the multi-dimensional nature of officials' identities to sustain their projects. The seed case I described in my chapter was able to benefit from the Harvard brand, but it is essential to identify resources and allies within a community, even when such resources and allies are not initially obvious. It is also worth noting that repression has costs, and not all governments will shut down all civic engagement activities, even in authoritarian countries. Thus, it is important to maintain faith and be strategic when importing civic engagement education into authoritarian countries. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Two further authors, co-authors of a chapter on Singapore are here, Dr. Sanger and Dr. Yu. Very interesting case study of Singapore, in a particular country, city-state, in effect. To what extent do you think your case study in Singapore can be transitioned to other countries around the world, or is it particularly unique in the Singaporean context?
Maylit, you want to take this one?
Thanks, Kate. I'm just going to quickly and let Kate jump in a bit. I think our chapter highlight 3 levels in terms of the kind of context that need to be, the context where educators need to be sensitive to. One, the macro climate, which is the political climate of that particular country, the meso climate, i.e. the campus climate, where university leadership and the staff members would have to play a significant role in ensuring that free spaces are retained within the campus spaces. And of course, the microclimate in terms of the classroom, the pedagogical devices, as well as even things like residential spaces and common spaces, all these spaces that combine to create important learning opportunities. And I think the general principle of this we believe as authors that can be transitioned into other contexts given its pliability in that framework. Kate, you could jump into.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think the other thing that's important to note about the Singapore context, as we worked on this project, the more we researched and wrote, the more I realized that what we were finding was really not specific to Singapore. It was about educational institutions and those spaces that Waylid is describing that we help to create as educators. One of the decisive factors of Singapore, though, is that local and national politics are the same thing because it's a city-state. And this can be very helpful in motivating students to engage, because when they make a dent in city politics, they're making a dent in national politics, and their work feels very consequential. And that's made me rethink how I might go about this kind of work outside of a city state, and that maybe there's real gains to be had by focusing more on the local, not always getting students swept up in presidential elections, but focusing on things where they can see the ramifications and the consequences of their investment and circle back to it. We also saw a theme of intergenerational investment by students, where one student cohort would start an organization and the next one would deepen the ties to the community. And then a new class would come in and further the mission. And when you're working on a more local level, you can have that kind of gradual scaling up that motivates students to kind of stay the course. So that would be one of the lessons that I take from this work, certainly.
That's great. Thank you very much. And fascinating outcomes which are further explored in the chapter. If we can maybe move on to our author on the British case study, Dr. John Craig. Dr. Craig, in your chapter, you highlight the particular role or not of UK universities in sort of the development of civic engagement education. I just wonder if you could cast a few words in relation to what you see as being the non-role in some ways of UK universities and their importance.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. My chapter goes back to the mid-19th century and takes a really long historical view of the development of civic engagement in the United Kingdom. And I think that is helpful because so often it's the immediate crises that we are focused on in terms of politics, and rightly so. But it's always important, I think, to realise that many of these challenges have been encountered by previous generations, and to learn from how previous generations were successful or unsuccessful in taking things forward. Much like the sort of model that Sherry talked about earlier, in the UK, the initial focus on civic engagement, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, but also at the other early 20th century universities, was very much focused on the elite of students, people from elite backgrounds, or particularly men from elite backgrounds, who were then expecting to go into elite positions. And really one of the challenges there was that model very much decayed and very much stopped educating even those students particularly well about civic engagement. But very much the assumption for the wider population was that they wouldn't have an active role. Citizenship for them was about loyalty, about trusting the political leaders, not about activity. And one of the things that's changed in the last, I've argued 20 years, or perhaps 30 years, is that UK universities have begun to take a far more active role in terms of engaging a far wider part of the population in terms of preparation for citizenship. But I suppose the three elements I come back to are, politics doesn't stand still. What worked yesterday doesn't necessarily work today. We need innovation to face the new challenges that we face. We need that to be based in values. We can't just rely on latching onto latest government funding scheme, because that doesn't sustain activity. We need to have this based in our values, and we need advocates to call for civic engagement and work flat, and all that requires leadership from academics, educators, political scientists, to ensure that we can sustain civic engagement.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Craig. We'd like to go back to the important points that we began at the beginning of this discussion in this section with Dr. Ortbals and Dr. Lepreet, and particularly that question where we were looking at the role of women and how they're often excluded in political deliberation, and the notion of political hobbyists. I would welcome, after having reflected on some of the discussions so far, if we go back and sort of elaborate a bit more on that before we move on to section 2.
I think really what some of the other contributors have said has been very helpful here, especially with Catherine emphasizing the local sphere. That was definitely an emphasis in our own chapter. And the idea for us to put transnational feminism with global engagement really came from the fact that transnational feminists want to look at women in particular local context and not assume women everywhere need the same thing or want the same thing. And we took that same ethic of emphasizing the local, or what we call local level contexts that have sort of the impacts of globalization set upon it, and ask ourselves, what could students learn about those local contexts, whether that is somewhere in a different part of the world or even in their own backyard. So we think transnational feminists really focus us on looking at that local level. And then they also really emphasize a sense of what we call feminist empathy, but is very similar in the literature to what's been called global empathy. This sense of that we don't want to be tourists and just kind of see people in other places and be like, what are they doing about their politics, and not really engage them. So our idea of empathy was really just that we want to be sensitive to the injustices of women that women and men in other places are facing, and really actively engage them by magnifying the voices of women in the local sphere. So this works for women, but also men in various local places as well. Very, very different people with different intersectional identities. We were hoping people would take this ethic of transnational pedagogy and transnational feminism and really think about how students could come to understand other people, whether that's through self-reflection and engaging how other people live, but also maybe even trying to connect with them through technologies around the world, and come to know other activists in local contexts as sort of comrades, and hoping to create a better world apart from some of the injustices we see arising today.
Thank you. Dr. LeBlanc, do you wish to say anything before we move on to section 2?
I think we're ready to move on.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Dr. Sun, talk about section 2.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Blair. So Professor Elizabeth Maddow and I co-edited section 2. In this section, we offer a selection of examples of teaching civic engagement from different regions of the world, exploring pedagogical techniques utilized in established and establishing democracies. Our 5 chapters cover cases from 7 countries: Ireland, Egypt, New Zealand, Russia, Belize, Guatemala, and Greece. We're fortunate to have authors from 3 of the 5 chapters here with us today: Dr. Dmitry Lenko, Dr. Gerardo Berthing, Dr. Theodore Chattopadhyay, and Dr. Georgia Panagiotidou. Let's start with Russia. Dr. Lenko, your simulations with students suggested that civic engagement can have surprisingly positive results on student civic engagement. In 2 minutes, could you explain in what ways would you say such instruction can be an effective form of democratic education, even in more authoritarian settings?
Thanks, Taim. That's really a great question because, well, anywhere where political science is taught in universities and high schools, it's quite simple to use this model. But then we have worse cases where political science is prohibited. You see, what we do matter, because otherwise, why do dictators prohibit what we do in their countries? Like nearby Russia, we've got this not that funny case of Uzbekistan, where political science education was banned entirely between 2015 and 2019. And you know what happened? Exactly in those years, I saw a big increase in the number of students coming from Uzbekistan to Russia into my class to study political science and international relations here, because it wasn't possible in their home country. And from this year on, my university has launched a double degree program with the University of Tashkent, so we can teach students from Uzbekistan in this bridge mode. And then definitely what I have been doing for the past few years, and recently this work intensified thanks to COVID, I have been moving this exercise online. So anybody could participate in it if this anybody has got a cell phone connected to internet. And well, that's what many people have. So probably my next publication will be about what came out of this. So this is funny indeed, because I agree Russia is not very experienced in democracy, but at the same time for Uzbekistan, Russia looks very much like a window to freedom, one of them for those students. And to generalize and to sum up, civic engagement education must be international. We cannot stop at the national border. We cannot do something to this country and then forget about what's going on just around across the river or whatever separates this country from another country. It really needs to be international. We really need to involve as many students as possible. Of course, it's impossible to physically bring everybody across borders, but we need to use new technologies. We need to think of more new opportunities just to make sure that we involve as many people from as many countries as it is possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's move on to Dr. Berthing. Your chapter focuses on the social audit, a participatory pedagogical intervention delivered in workshops with young leaders. So what are the essential elements of the approach and how or why was it effective?
Sure, thank you, Gia. I think the departing premise is that young people in emerging democracies are not being exposed in a large scale to civic engagement approaches. So the social audit is really an interesting approach that kind of takes advantage in three directions, I think. One, it is an instrument to actually mobilize and engage citizens to measure government performance. Two, it actually provides also an oversight function for basic public services that are being offered by the government. And three, it is certainly a way to promote the civic engagement. We did 20 interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also in our chapter, we analyzed the role of international cooperation agencies, such as the United Nations and the US Agency for International Development. Youth between the ages of 18 and 35 years of age were exposed, and we developed these two cases because I think they're the only two where local universities were actually engaged, and we lay down not only the different tools that social audit involves, but also some of the results. And I think, as you will read, it offers some very interesting, hopeful, and optimistic perspectives for emerging democracies. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Berthing. So now let's move on to the case of Greece. In the more established democracy of Greece, this chapter involves university students essentially teaching politics to fellow students and even to high school students. So Dr. Chatripadoulis and Dr. Panagotidou, why is peer-to-peer learning a meaningful route for teaching civic engagement?
Let Georgia speak and I will probably comment something. I was prepared for the Fidel Castro lecture, the 2 days, not 2 minutes. So let Georgia speak.
Okay, let me first say some things about the situation about civic education in Greece. In Greece, civic education is present in the compulsory education. However, it is in a very limited way and inadequate. More importantly, during 2020, civic education was further decreased in schools. So, and some of the compulsory lessons were abolished. This makes our project even more important because we have to understand the importance of civic education after all in high schools and to students after all. What we describe in our chapter is this project of students teaching other students. So in our department, our political sciences students have the opportunity to take an elective course, the Teaching Civic Education, which is under the leading guidance of Professor Hadjipadoulis. So these students, political science students, are trained to teach civic education with interactive tools to apply workshops and things that are more innovative and more, let's say, interesting for the audience. So the political science students prepare their material, learn the methods, and they apply these things in some micro-teaching sessions in front of their co-students. When they are ready, the most important is that they appear in real classrooms in high schools, and they teach civic education in some kind of workshop projects in high schools, in high schoolers. There are many things to gain from this project. First of all, for the high schoolers, these children have the opportunity to listen for civic education, to be educated from young people who are closer to them. So they find it interesting, they feel more engaged, and they have the opportunity to simulate the role of an active citizen in these workshops. For the co-students that have the chance to also be present in the micro-teaching sessions, they have people from the same age group teaching them civic education, so they have the chance to become more active and be interested in politics. And the political science students that teach, they have the opportunity to see this career path of teaching civic education and gain a very important toolbox of innovative, interactive learning methods in civic education. So Professor Hansi Padelis can talk to us about this year's project, which is adapted in the situation.
It doesn't matter. We will do something about COVID and the ideas of being a trauma, a cultural trauma, or just an incident, and see how the people they receive all this information. I might say that this idea is, as the president said, to transform a young person, a pupil or a high school student, to a critical thinking, responsible citizen, and provide him all the tools to decide, to make decisions under critical thinking, and not just by saying, okay, this is that, this is this. This is the whole idea. I mean, is the point, the main point, as it is described in every constitution in every country of the world. Education should transform a young person to a critical thinking, responsible citizen. This is our effort. So for the next year, we will do this thing for COVID situation, and we will be able to present this whole thing.
Thank you. That's very well said. Thank you so much.
In person.
Yes, and you can find out more about our authors' pedagogies and researches in the book. So now, Dr. Elizabeth Bennion will facilitate the discussion on section 3.
Thank you very much. I want to start first with Abe Goldberg, Kara Ong-Whaley, and Suzanne Chod, who considered how college campuses can really train students to bring about the kind of democracy we aspire to be. Their chapter offers a comparative look at how two institutions, a small private liberal arts college in a major metropolitan area and a large comprehensive university in a rural area, embed civic engagement for all students through co-curricular and curricular approaches. I want to start with Professor Chod. Can you briefly talk about how your campus integrated civic engagement into the general education curriculum? I think that is something that all of us have aspired to at one point or another, and what we should consider if we want to do the same on our campuses.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about this important book and about the work that we did in this chapter. So I'm Suzanne Chod. I teach at North Central College, which is a liberal arts college outside of Chicago. And so I'll just take a quick step back that about 4 years ago, the college made a decision to switch from trimesters to semesters, to go from 3 credit hours to 4 credit hours. So we kind of started from the ground up and overhauled, and it gave a perfect opportunity for us to not only rethink our curriculum to fit into this new system, but to really rethink what are we committed to and what do we want to be doing? And so the first step with this was a newly constructed mission. And I think for any of us that have done any kind of curricular design, we do this sort of backward way of thinking where we start with what are the most important things and we move forward. So for the college, for us, it was important for the mission. And so one of our newly constructed mission focuses on preparing students to be curious, engaged, ethical, and purposeful citizens in multiple contexts. And so that citizens is a really important component there. And what does that mean? Well, so when we created our 11 learning outcomes for the college that mostly are assessed in our general education, we actually focused 5 of the 11 exclusively on things related to civic engagement. So whether it's developing worldview, whether it's evaluating ethical dimensions, whether it's explaining civic identities across different contexts, engaging in dialogue, especially if things engaging dialogue about civic issues, and then analyzing power structures, inequities, hierarchies among groups, particularly groups across race, ethnicity, gender, and class. These are the 5 learning outcomes that, as I said, focus exclusively on civic identity and civic engagement. And so then the question is, where do we put these things in the general education? And so what we did here is, yes, we have a distribution model like a lot of places, but we really amplified that by having different parts of the curriculum that infuse these learning outcomes. And so in the first year seminar, students really look at their place on campus, and then moving along across to their place in the world. And then they reevaluate this in their senior seminar once they've taken all of their classes and their majors and minors. We do this with the core part of the general education, which is our interdisciplinary connections, or our icons, where students take classes across the college on one theme. 2 of our themes are exclusively on civic education, and we've got courses across different programs. We have co and extracurricular opportunities for students, and a community engaged learning requirement where students partner with an organization that deals with a societal problem. So that's a quick way to talk about what we've done. And I think the important thing for any college that's thinking of doing this is really to think about how do we work backwards for what is important to the college, and then to create cross-campus partnerships. It's not just political science, it's not just the administration, it's not just faculty. It's how do we infuse all of this into our curriculum and have buy-in from across the campus to make sure that a student cannot finish with a degree from your institution without engaging in their own civic identity and talking about the civic identity of others.
Thank you. And as somebody who wrote about backward design and assessing civic learning outcomes, that last part is, of course, music to my ears. Great, quick overview, and folks can read the chapter to learn more. Professor Goldberg and Professor Ongwele, I want to turn next to you. You work with the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement, which is a nonpartisan academic center at James Madison University, to really work year-round to develop engaged citizens and civic programming. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and the sort of pros and cons of this approach in terms of reaching students?
Sure, and thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to be part of this project and this webinar. One of the great outcomes has been a chance to collaborate with Suzanne and the wonderful work happening at her university. As you mentioned, Dr. Benyon, we operate a campus-wide initiative at James Madison University, which has 22,000 students. We have campus-wide civic learning outcomes that we assess regularly. And really, we are targeting our work at the entire campus community. I think one thing that is important to take away is that when we started this initiative, we found that our campus was actually pretty apolitical. We found that through a campus-wide political learning climate study where our students expressed fear from engaging political issues. There was also a certain amount of privilege that they didn't feel like they needed to be thinking about political issues. And that was coupled with an overall culture of kindness that our campus has. And whereas we think kindness is obviously a good thing, sometimes strengthening that culture of kindness can unfortunately pull away from authenticity and realizing that people are underrepresented and being marginalized in our community. And so the work that we do is nonpartisan, but it is very political. And our work is to demystify and normalize political learning on a campus in a way that really embraces the challenges that we're facing to bring more realization to our students about some of the things that they're going to be facing as participants in democracy. I'll turn it over to my colleague sharing the screen with me to say more.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Thank you, Dr. Benyon. And so great to see you, Suzanne, and want to be able to participate with all of you and hear from all of these amazing co-authors and the work that you're doing. I think for us, and I've heard this echoed in some of the other statements already, we are starting with what is the democracy we want to see and how do we get there and how can we reimagine it? And for us, it's really about pulling together, collaborating, and we're co-creating with students, faculty, staff, and our community partners in order to increase their own agency, knowledge, and capacity to redefine and reimagine democratic practices and institutions so that it is more participatory. I think for us, one of the things that we are trying to normalize is that we embrace difficult conversations. We do that through creating spaces on campus to have difficult conversations around pressing public challenges and issues facing not only our local community, but also our entire globe. And stopping students wherever, if they're going on their way to class, to invite them into those conversations and to think more deeply. And then finally, as part of that, we want to ensure that we are centering historically marginalized voices in the work that we do, and making sure that we are not just perpetuating and instantiating existing inequalities and inequities in our society, in our democracy, and in our economy.
Thank you. And I know in your chapter, there is this sense of urgency, in a sentence or two. I wonder if you could say where that sense of urgency comes from. Suzanne, Todd, do you understand?
Sorry, I wasn't sure who we were going to first. One of the things that was so beautiful with Bill and I contributing with our colleagues at James Madison is that we all agreed that this, if we don't do this now, then we are too late. That as we are more globalized, as democracies are fraying across the world, as we are facing long-standing and overdue conversations about deep inequities that the pandemic just showed us even more existed, that it is incumbent upon political scientists and campuses more generally to make civic engagement, education, dialoguing at the heart of everything that we do, even when it's hard, because it's never been more important than it is right now.
I want to turn, in the interest of time, let's turn to Professor Piper and to Sandra Bailey. They wrote about their experiences in South Africa to explain how civic engagement works in a work integrated learning framework and how that framework can be used. Let's start with you, Professor Piper. Can you explain the concept of work integrated learning and how it relates to civic engagement and community-based research?
Thank you, Dr. Benyon, and very nice to be here at this great launch. So very quickly, work integrated learning is a form of practice-based learning that we're implementing in the postgraduate level at the University of the Western Cape. And the core idea is to better prepare students for working life by integrating theoretical knowledge that they learn in the classroom with practical knowledge that they learn in the workplace. Now, work integrated learning in South Africa makes a lot of sense because of our high unemployment and the immense pressure on our graduates to get work. But it's not necessarily connected to civic engagement. It comes from the vocations and the professions. But we've seen this as an opportunity to promote civic engagement and, in fact, as an obligation, because political science graduates work in the public sphere rather than the private sphere, and they must engage in a context that's informed by democratic values and practices. So in our chapter, we show how we use the WILL program to enhance civic engagement by having students do community-based research in partnership with the human rights NGO. As a result of that, not only did the NGO use that research in their advocacy, the students were able to use the data for their theses, and we also found that the experience was one that reinforced democratic citizenship values and practices of most of the participants in the project.
want to turn now to your co-author with this question, which is, what national context might make using a work integrated approach particularly useful or relevant? Why is this a useful framework to use?
I think that, as a university student who actually did the work integrated learning process, it creates a consciousness of rights. You feel personally responsible for making people aware of what their human rights are, and then trying to ensure that their rights are met as citizens. It shows you, and it also almost automatically forces you to then participate in your community, whether you planned on being in that community or not. And it gives you this experience that you can then continue and use at a later point in life, especially within the NGO space, which I then also ended up using, and then found employment in the NGO space quite soon after completing the project. I think work integrated learning then also demands accountability. So you feel, well, personally, I felt that the state needed to do more for our citizens, and which has then also led to me working in the NGO space and continuing that fight for the rights of South African citizens. And I think lastly, that then also meant that we stood together in solidarity, which sort of gives way to the open, because of the openness and kindness that we experienced working with community members. You feel this almost personal connection to them, and it forces you to just fight that extra bit and work that extra bit harder to ensure that the state is held accountable.
Yeah, I think one of the things in reviewing your chapter and thinking even in the US case, but also countries worldwide, is this focus often on professional development. And so when we have support for professional learning, work integrated learning, but not necessarily civic engagement education, it's interesting to think about how those can be combined to get all those kind of learning benefits that you described. I want to turn next to Nicole Webster. Professor Webster, you really talked about recentering the ecosystem of global civic engagement. So I want to ask you, what needs to be decentered, what needs to be recentered, and what does this look like? How can we do this?
Okay, so again, thank you for having me this afternoon. My chapter was really structured around this collaborative center that we have at Penn State University as an opportunity to begin to think about how we are purposeful and intentional and including those voices that are not necessarily marginalized within their own context, but have been systematically excluded and marginalized from the US context. And so for me, when I thought about the populations with whom I work with, which are mainly folks from the African diaspora, I wanted to make sure that the centering was their voices, their experiences, their histories, which are often not part of the discourse when we prepare students to be quote unquote global citizens. That centering of information and histories is often shaped from a Western lens, a Western perspective. And so that recentering and rethinking about global citizenship really does put the emphasis on these particular populations, their voices, their experiences, their participation in their own political construction has been there, but that narrative has not always been a part of the discourse and narrative from the US perspective. So that's what I meant by recentering, decentering of this global conversation.
And folks, in the interest of time, we have to move on, but you can learn a lot more about how Professor Webster designed the experience and how students responded to it to really take this recentering of often excluded voices and perspectives into account and really center that as part of the work. We will turn now to Allison McCartney, who will lead the discussion of section 4.
Thank you, Professor Benyon. As access to higher education expands to more people, educators, and administrators, access to higher education expands to more people, educators and administrators face a wider range of students' knowledge and skills when they enter college. We need to provide welcoming communities which support all manners of diversity, but we must also address what Elizabeth Beaumont has termed the democratic achievement gap. This section looks at where we might confront that gap before students reach college, such as in the training of teachers, vocational education, and K-12 education. We have two of our authors in this section today. Let me begin with the chapter, My Participation is Often Dismissed, How Vocational School Students Participate in Society by Nina Meriläinen of Tampere University in Finland. Professor Meriläinen, your chapter looks at an often neglected student population across the world, vocational students, in this case at the high school level. Can you discuss how systemic structures may impact these students' ability to meaningfully participate in their democracy? And can you suggest one or two important tools to overcome the barriers to participation amongst this group?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. It has been a pleasure listening to you all. So let's dive in. So basically my research is about both theoretical and empirical research about power relations in democratic participation and what participation in reality is in a democratic state, such as in Finland. But my research and naturally other researchers have shown that such state as in Finland, we have multiple forms of power relations in youth participation. When it comes to youth participation, normally in Finland, we think about high school students from good families, from larger cities. We don't really pay any attention to participation of vocational school students. Vocational school students' participation is not being seen, is not being listened to, and also it's not being discussed by policymakers either in grassroots levels or in legislative processes. As my chapter showcases, vocational school students from various backgrounds in Finland, there's no teaching of human rights participation, there's no teaching of civic participation, and there's no teaching of critical thinking in vocational schools in Finland. These young people are only seen as proletariat, so as workers in Finnish societies. They are not seen as change makers or active young people who have any willingness or know how to participate in democratic society. So how do we combat this? First, we have to admit that there are power relations in youth participation. We have to admit that there are structures that prevent young people from various backgrounds to participate. One such thing is that youth participation in Finland is often tied to existing structures, so legislative processes and youth councils. In Finland, there is no other forms that has been, quote unquote, admitted to being official participation. Secondly, we must understand where the inequalities in participation lie. Those inequalities, they lie in teaching, they lie in schools. So young people in Finland are divided into two based on where they go to their secondary schooling for their secondary education. High school students are being seen as agenda setters and are being seen as change makers, while at the same time, vocational school students are only being seen as workers. So what should be done is that we should combine the teachings from high school students to vocational school students so they would get an equal amount of civic engagement teaching and also human rights and critical thinking teaching. And may I add that we should also expand the understanding what participation is. So for example, my co-researchers in my research, they state multiple ways that they are active in the society, but those ways are not understood as legitimate participation. So there lies basically the root problem. So we need to expand the understanding of participation. So I can leave it at that. If you are interested in this sort of power relations and human rights research, I will be more than happy to discuss with you on a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marilainen. Now we move to a chapter by Professor Chantal Kurwa and Sheetal Sheena Sukrajawa, which discusses changes in civic engagement education in the island country of Mauritius. Professors Sukrajawa and Kurwa, Mauritius has been undergoing some significant changes in the past 50 years, establishing a democracy after colonial rule, and then various changes in that democratic government. A few years ago, many referred to Mauritius as a successful example of post-colonial democracy. But now there are doubts, in particular about the civic engagement of youth. Can you tell us what has changed regarding youth civic engagement education in Mauritius, and why those changes are so detrimental to the future of Mauritian democracy?
Yes, thank you, Alison. My chapter is based on the implementation of civic education in primary and secondary school curriculum in Mauritius, because according to Transparency Mauritius, there has been less allegiance of the young generation to democratic civic attitudes and inadequate political interest that lead to an alarming decline in voters' turnout in public elections. So is this political detachment among young Mauritians due to lack of political knowledge and skills, preventing future citizens to assume their civic responsibility? So there were informal interviews with a small sample of Mauritian students that were carried out, which revealed some possible concern of lack of civic education. And as per the CACI-structured survey carried out, a large majority of students did not understand the basic components of the government and how it functions. So these students have experienced the new curriculum, and the results suggest that the lack of civic education is impacting their ability to engage as knowledgeable and active citizens. And also, when the new secondary school social studies textbooks were issued in 2013, the previous extensive sections on democracy and governance were eliminated from the 1980s social textbook. So there are academic disciplines such as social studies, history, geography, and sociology encouraged in Mauritius, but they don't satisfactorily socialize a youngster politically. So as we can see, civic education is a prominent component at academic level, which should be promoted as a subject, though it needs further development in Mauritius. And to conclude, the ultimate findings of the research that we did, it acknowledges the political indifference and illiteracy among young Mauritians. And the youth comprise just over 1/3 of the population in Mauritius. And if their civic education is neglected, this situation could be dangerous for democracy such as Mauritius. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kurwa. Professor Sukrajawa, anything to add very, very briefly?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Allison. So I would just like to mention that although Mauritius is portrayed as a democratic government to the world, but in the inside, there are lots of democratic issues prevailing. So why the situation has changed is that people keep voting for the same political parties since independence. So it has always been governed by two political parties, rather a dynastic politics. So all these, we intend to study what's the real issue about Mauritian democracy. It's this lack of civic education, and predominantly that specific chapters in books have been removed regarding democracy and government in Mauritius, which makes it more difficult for people to be aware about the political system of Mauritius and how the elections and about the electoral system in Mauritius. So this is a very brief about our chapter. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Indeed, we need to give equal attention to all the countries around the world as we pursue civic engagement education of our youth. Now I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Dick Simpson, who has really served as the guiding force behind all three of these civic engagement books. It's been a great pleasure to work with him and learn from him. Dr. Simpson, are you ready to bring us home? Tie it all together for us.
I am. We don't have time to go over everything that we've covered in terms of next steps, but we're clearly moving into a new age of civic engagement. When we started a decade ago, civic engagement was really what we should do in our individual courses. We're now working to figure out how should we work across the disciplines, across the university as a total entity, and now how to do global civic engagement and how to collaborate across countries and across the world. But if we're going to do this, we really have to have a plan of action for better cooperation between us and our organizations and across many nations. Basically, we need more resources, we need more knowledge, and we need more recognition. So first of all, we need better recognition and greater funding at the national and university levels. Most nations don't recognize those who provide civic engagement education. Second, we need to pass new laws in nearly all of our nations requiring civic engagement education at the elementary and high school level, like the new bill that's pending in the Congress of the United States that's called Civic Secures Democracy Act. It's pending in the US Congress today, but we don't know whether it's going to pass. And basically what it would do is elevate civics to the level of STEM education in the United States. The laws would be different in different countries, but the idea of making sure that civic engagement is required and funded at the high school level and at the elementary school level prepares us for being able to do a better job at teaching at the university and college level. And as you've heard from many of the great presentations today, and even in more depth in the book itself, we have to develop model civic learning programs, including in less liberal countries, like the example of Uzbekistan and Russia and China and so on that are in the book. We don't really know how that's to be done. And there's very little written on it. So we need to promote the teaching of civic learning everywhere, using all the tools, and we can all borrow from each other. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. One of the things we have to do, of course, is to promote the publication of research on the scholarship of teaching civic engagement. The Marxists call this controlling the means of production, but what it means in practice is new books, new journal articles, more articles and newsletters and blogs, because this is essentially a new field. And what the American Political Science Association and the American Association of Colleges and Universities and other organizations like that have done is to lift up this teaching of civic engagement, and the scholarship of teaching civic engagement simply means understanding how it's done best and how it can be adapted to many different circumstances. So we need support by national and international education associations. We need to be able to control conferences. We need to have publications. We need to have awards that recognize us for the best of civic engagement. We need to create subsections in disciplinary fields like political science and history, sociology, and all of the other ones. And finally, three things. We need to make civic engagement a meaningful component of merit and promotion decisions at our very own universities. It's not enough to say, well, it's good, kid, go out and teach civic engagement. Of course, we won't give you any credit for you. You won't get raises, you won't get promoted, and you'll be kicked out of the academy. That's not a formula for success. And changing P&T and even raise situations in our universities and colleges is not an easy task, but it is one that we must demand and one we have a right to. Secondly, as happened with many of the articles in this book, we have to expand civic engagement to training schools and community colleges where there aren't the traditional four-year college or the R1 university with the grand name and the billion-dollar endowments. But we have to be teaching civic engagement in high schools and all of the different systems of education that we have in every nation in which we're a part. But this is not something that we need to do just in a single university or in a single discipline or in a single nation. So it's important that we make this part of the united efforts across the globe. And one way to do that is either to adopt a new United Nations declaration or to amend the 2018 UN Youth Declaration on World Youth Citizenship. Most of us didn't know that they even knew about us, the youth that is, in the United Nations. And we need to get a broader platform that's recognized internationally and lends us strength to do our job locally. So this book is a great start, but we have a lot of work left to do, and we need a common agenda and an agreement upon that agenda, and that's what we try and find in the provide in the final chapter. Good luck to all of us, and good congratulations to everyone who is part of this effort worldwide.
So thank you to Professor Simpson, not only for that call to action, but for your incredible dedication to this issue and really championing the publication of all three of these texts. A reminder that Teaching Civic Engagement Globally, as well as the two previous books, are available for free on the Teaching Civic Engagement microsite housed by APSA, and the URL has been posted several times. Today has clearly just been a whirlwind global tour. There is much more to learn by going in, accessing the books. We hope you will go not only access this one, but previous ones. A quick thank you to all the people that made this possible today, certainly all of the editors and contributors to the text. I want to say a couple of quick thank yous to some Eagleton folks and APSA folks. I want to thank Clarissa Westphal-Noguera from the American Political Science Association, who helped get the microsite ready for today's event, as well as Rutgers student Jackson Snellman, who participated in assisting with the website, and then colleagues here, Max Vasquez and Ben Clapp, for pulling off this technological feat. So thank you all for helping us to put this event together, but most importantly, thank you all for joining us, and have a good day.